In the heart of the American financial system lies an institution of immense power and mystery, the Federal Reserve. It is the central bank of the United States, the creator of its currency, and the regulator of its monetary policy. But to many, it is the centerpiece of a century-long conspiracy to control the wealth of a nation. This story begins not in 1913 with the Fed's creation, but in the preceding decades of financial turmoil. America in the late 19th century was a nation of booms and busts, a volatile landscape without a central lender. Financial panics were common, sweeping through the economy like a plague. The Panic of 1907 was the final straw, a crisis so severe it threatened to bring the entire system down. In the absence of a central bank, the fate of the economy fell into the hands of one man, J.P. Morgan. Morgan, using his own capital and influence, organized a bailout, personally deciding which firms would live and which would die. While he was hailed as a hero, the crisis highlighted a dangerous reality. The nation's financial stability rested on the whims of private bankers. The public and politicians alike clamored for reform, for a governmental solution to the nation's monetary chaos. This public demand for safety, however, would become the perfect cover for a private takeover. In November 1910, a group of the world's most powerful men boarded a sealed train car under the cloak of secrecy. Their destination was a private island off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. The meeting was arranged by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a powerful Republican with deep ties to the banking elite. He was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., connecting him to one of the largest fortunes in the world. With him were representatives from the houses of Morgan, Rockefeller and Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Also present was Paul Warburg, a German immigrant and partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and an expert on European central banking. For over a week, these men debated and drafted a piece of legislation in total secrecy. They were writing the charter for a new American central bank, a plan that would later be known as the Aldrich Plan. The plan was designed to appear as a government entity, but its core was to be owned and controlled by private banks. It would give these bankers the power to create money out of thin air and lend it to the government at interest. It would be a machine for generating perpetual debt. When the Aldrich Plan was presented to Congress, it was met with fierce opposition, decried as a banker's scheme. Conspirators needed a new strategy, a new public face for their private plan. They found their champion in the newly elected president, Woodrow Wilson. The bankers repackaged the Aldrich Plan, changing the name to the Federal Reserve Act. They presented it as a way to break the power of the money trust they themselves represented. With Wilson's support, and through clever political maneuvering, the act was pushed through Congress. It was passed on December 23, 1913, when many members of Congress had already left for the Christmas holiday. President Wilson signed it into law, an act he would later come to deeply regret. He would write, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country." A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit, he lamented. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. The Federal Reserve System was born, a central bank with 12 regional branches. Crucially, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private corporation owned by its member banks. These banks, in turn, are owned by some of the wealthiest families in the world. The Fed was granted a monopoly on the issuance of the nation's currency. Every dollar created is not an asset, but a loan, born as debt. When the government needs money, It issues bonds, which are essentially IOUs. The Federal Reserve buys these bonds by creating new money, literally out of nothing. The government then pays interest to the Fed on the money that was created. This interest is paid by the American taxpayers through income tax. It is no coincidence that the 16th Amendment, establishing a federal income tax, was ratified in the same year the Fed was created. The income tax was necessary to guarantee the revenue stream to the private bankers who owned the Fed. The first major test and opportunity for the new system was World War I. The war allowed the Fed to create vast sums of money to finance the war effort, indebting the nation on an unprecedented scale. After the war, the Fed's control over the money supply allowed it to engineer an economic boom, the Roaring Twenties. By expanding credit, the Fed fueled a massive stock market bubble. Ordinary people were encouraged to speculate, borrowing money to buy stocks on margin. The wealth seemed endless, but it was built on a foundation of sand. In 1929, the architects of the boom decided it was time to pull the plug. The Fed began to quietly contract the money supply, tightening credit. The margin loans were called in, forcing speculators to sell their stocks at any price. The stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. This was not an accident, according to the conspiracy narrative, but a deliberate, calculated event. Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee, condemned the Fed. It was a carefully contrived occurrence, he declared on the floor of Congress. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair, so that they might emerge as rulers of us all. During the Depression, the Fed's contraction of the money supply starved the economy of capital. The bankers who were in on the scheme were able to buy up assets, companies, real estate, and resources for pennies on the dollar. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in American history. In the midst of this, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102 in 1933. This order forced all Americans to turn in their private gold holdings to the Federal Reserve. The penalty for refusal was a $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. Once the gold was collected, the government immediately raised the official price of gold from $20.67 to $35 an ounce. This instantly devalued the dollar and gave the government a massive profit on the gold it had just confiscated. The age of gold as a direct check on government spending was ending for the average citizen. Following World War II, the world's financial leaders met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They established a new international monetary system. The US dollar, backed by gold at $35 an ounce, was crowned the world's reserve currency. Other nations would peg their currencies to the dollar, and the US dollar promised to redeem their dollars for gold upon request. This system worked for a time, fueling a post-war economic boom. However, the US began to abuse its exorbitant privilege. It printed more dollars than it had gold to back them up, primarily to finance the Vietnam War and expanding social programs. Other countries, particularly France, grew suspicious and began demanding gold for their dollar reserves. The US gold supply began to dwindle rapidly. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television to make a shocking announcement. He unilaterally and temporarily suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This Nixon shock effectively ended the Bretton Woods system. The temporary suspension became permanent. For the first time in history, the entire world was on a purely fiat monetary system. Money was no longer backed by anything of value. It was backed only by government decree and public confidence. And most importantly, it was backed by the power of the Federal Reserve to manage it. This gave the Fed unprecedented power to inflate the money supply without any physical constraint. The decades that followed were marked by rampant inflation and economic volatility. The value of the dollar, once a symbol of stability, began a steady and relentless decline. Fed's chairman, from Paul Volcker to Alan Greenspan, became economic celebrities. Their cryptic statements could move global markets in an instant. They were the high priests of a new economic religion, speaking in a language few could understand. Greenspan's era of low interest rates fueled the dot-com bubble and, later, the housing bubble. Each boom was followed by a devastating bust, wiping out the savings of millions. The 2008 financial crisis was the culmination of this cycle. The very banks that had caused the crisis through reckless speculation were deemed too big to fail. The Federal Reserve's response was to create money on a scale never before imagined. Through a program called quantitative easing, the Fed purchased trillions of dollars in toxic assets from the banks. This bailed out the shareholders and executives of the largest financial institutions. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens lost their homes and jobs. The Fed's balance sheet swelled from less than $1 trillion to many trillions, a permanent expansion of the monetary base. This, critics argue, is the ultimate endgame of the conspiracy. A system where a private, unaccountable central bank has the power to create infinite money. It can bail out its friends, punish its enemies, and control the economic life of every citizen. It creates boom-bust cycles that allow the transfer of real assets from the public to the financial elite. It finances endless wars and government expansion through the hidden tax of inflation. The dollar is no longer a stable store of value, but a rapidly depreciating tool of control. The conspiracy theory of the Federal Reserve is not just about money. It is about the loss of national sovereignty and individual liberty. It posits that the power to create money is the power to control, and that this power was secretly given to a private cabal over a century ago. The debate rages on between the official history and the whispered conspiracy. Is the Fed a necessary stabilizer in a complex world? Or is it the creature from Jekyll Island, an entity that has enslaved a nation through the invisible chains of debt? The answer depends on who you ask, and which version of history you choose to believe. The system's architects understood human nature and the allure of apparent prosperity. By controlling the flow of credit, they could create the illusion of wealth for the masses. This illusion kept the public docile and unaware of the underlying mechanism of control. The true genius of the system was making the populace demand their own servitude. Every time the economy faltered, the public would cry out for the Fed to intervene. Each intervention, however, only strengthened the Fed's grip and deepened the nation's debt. The concept of moral hazard was institutionalized. Banks could take massive risks knowing they would be bailed out. This privatized profits and socialized losses, a core tenet of the alleged conspiracy. The media, often owned by or affiliated with the same financial interests, rarely questioned the Fed's fundamental structure. Instead, the focus remained on the public spectacle of political debates, a distraction from the real source of power. The education system, too, taught a sanitized version of economic history. The story of Jekyll Island remained a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. The power of the Fed also extended internationally, influencing foreign governments and economies. Through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, the dollar-based system could impose conditions on other nations. Nations that defied this system often faced severe economic or political consequences. Rise of digital currency and cryptocurrency is seen by some as a direct challenge to the Fed's monopoly. It represents a decentralized alternative, free from the control of a central authority. However, the established powers will not relinquish control easily. The narrative of the Federal Reserve conspiracy is a cautionary tale. It warns that power, especially the power over money, must be held accountable. It suggests that secrecy in governance is the enemy of liberty. And it forces us to ask the ultimate question: who controls our money? Is it we the people, as the Constitution intended? Or is it a small, unelected group operating from the shadows?